using ecologic pedagogy to frame a classroom study of rhetorical awareness. It's represented there as how do students write about rhetorical responsibilities.
It's a very narrow version of that initial title.
So that's important. I think she is one of a core of bright young scholars who are making a tremendous impact on this university and showing how the English department, through its improvement of academic writing and the promotion of the importance of writing scholarship to the humanities and universities, are making slow but inexorable and discernible contributions to this university. I hope that they continue with their enthusiasm and work, and whenever they honor the Humanities Center with signing up to give talks, I will schedule them. And Adrienne is an assistant professor of rhetoric and composition in the English department. She earned her BA at Valparaiso University in 2000, her MA in English composition and communication at Central Michigan University, and to show that she can be smart in 3 different places, she earned her PhD in English rhetoric and composition at Wayne here in 2014. With her colleague, Dr. Thomas Tremble, she recently published a piece entitled Features of Reflective Writing Using Taxonomies of Metacognitive Behaviors to Analyze Student Reflection and Improve Teaching Practice. And this was published in the journal Pedagogy, Critical Approaches to Teaching Literature, Language, Composition, and Culture. She studies reflexive writing. She also studies first-year writing, teacher development, and mentoring. She has taught English 1020 at Wayne State University since 2011. She has been awarded for her expertise in teaching writing with an Excellence in Teaching Writing Award from the Composition Program in 2015. And she has been a participant in the Center's programs, or Brown Bag Talks. This is not the first one. She gave one in 2013. She gave one in 2013, if I recall right. And she has been also a participant in the Humanities Center Composition Learning Communities Working Group from 2013 to 2015. Another Brown Bag talk that she gave most recently in 2018 with colleagues and students was entitled A Composition Learning Community in Action, Perspectives from Students, Peer Mentors, and Instructors. So you have here a passionate young scholar who is going to talk to you today on a narrowed down version of the topic I read at the beginning, and it is entitled, How Do Students Write About Rhetorical Responsibility? So please welcome to the podium Professor Adrienne Jenkins.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. And sorry for the change in title. As you know, when you promise you're going to do a talk, the eventual thing becomes a little bit different. And in this case, it's not what I put on in the abstract and in the initial title, but is just a little piece of that because I'm talking about a classroom study that I just did last fall. So I only got the data in my hands right before the holiday break and have begun analysis in the last couple of weeks. So you're hearing the first bits of that work. For my colleagues in the English department today, when I talk about English 1020, I'm trying to explain some parts of that for a bigger audience, but tune into the pieces that are different in my class than they are in the common syllabus structure so that you can get a sense of how I'm framing things. And I'm going to try to read talk a little bit today to you because this is kind of new analysis for me. So at some point I might sit down, we'll see. In recent decades, instruction in first-year writing, a course with content that's still widely disparate depending on institutional priorities, has nevertheless found some shared principles foundational to the classroom experience. For example, students must write for real audiences. Students must receive feedback on multiple drafts of their writing. Reading and responding to peers' work, if done meaningfully, can shape students' processes. Reflection on the writing process can help students improve their work in future projects and more. And as a field, we've come to these shared principles through a variety of pedagogical approaches and critical waves in research studies. But scholars in composition are also interested in how writing instruction helps students understand ways that writing brings people together, whether or not they're in a classroom together. The pedagogies I'll briefly describe in a moment, including my own, seem to share a goal of more deeply examining the connective tissue in our social writing ecologies in an effort to improve the ways we write and speak to each other as humans. I want us to start thinking about what other shared principles might become foundational to teaching college writing. In today's talk, I will explain a little of the motivation behind my English 1020 course, Rhetoric and Responsibility. I'll describe what the course looks like, and I'll explain the teacher research study I conducted last semester and am again this semester. And then I'll spend some time talking through an initial, like I said, but just very recent analysis of student work collected last semester. Finally, I'll reflect on the implications of this study in process, and I'll try to work through some of my own questions about conducting classroom studies and the degree to which those may need to be scaled or could usefully be scaled. The handouts are quotes that I'm going to reference throughout the talk. Yep. So I think those are just easier to have in front of you also. Okay. So in describing the motivation for this course, I'm going to draw quickly on two scholarly texts that I read over the summer while I was trying to think of what other teacher scholars have done courses like I wanted to teach and what's important to them. So I'm going to reference Patrick Sullivan's 2015, A New Writing Classroom, Listening, Motivation, Habits of Mind, in which he calls for a revolution in the way we teach first-year writing, and Sherry Stenberg's 2014, Repurposing Composition, Feminist Interventions for a Neoliberal Age, in which Stenberg asks us to see the ways that this revolution has already been starting and happening. I'm mentioning these two texts specifically today because these authors seem to share some of my pedagogical values, and what they propose might, I think, be leading us toward discovery of new shared foundational elements to first-year writing. These scholars propose teaching focused on listening, empathy, and reflection, and emotion, listening, agency, and responsibility, highlighting to me the ways that rhetorically attentive relationships can be at the center of our writing instruction. And here I'm just going to give the briefest gloss of each of their approaches. Much of Sullivan's approach is to take issue with common strategies for teaching argument. He tackles the formulaic 5-paragraph essay and other thesis-grounded argumentative writing for the kinds of reductive thinking that it can produce. Instead, he aims to support students in listening through what he calls a discourse of mindfulness, in which both discussion about how knowledge and perspectives are produced and written reflection on text work together. Stenberg discusses pedagogical approaches engaging emotion and listening to reclaim the composition classroom as a space to sow the seeds of change. So kind of looking past the sort of economic parts of general education to thinking about first-year writing as a place for change. She's really interested in making a space for discussion of emotion in rhetorical analysis and how we can help students rethink normative conceptions of emotions. Sullivan and Stenberg's approaches to teaching writing highlight some similar themes. We have to support students in reading, listening to, and analyzing a variety of perspectives, and reduce our expectation of a firm mastery of arguments as only binary. Our understanding of these perspectives must not include only identification of arguments and evidence, but also discussion and reflection on the ways that multiple aspects of rhetoric, including emotion, function in these presentations of perspective. My course, English 1020 Rhetoric and Responsibility, aims to do this work in three major ways: by refocusing course learning outcomes specifically on rhetorical knowledge and responsibility, by revising present English 1020 assignments to resist formulas and allow for more engagement with multiple perspectives, and by integrating reflective and peer review components that highlight attention to listening and responsibility. Students in my fall 2019 class explored working definitions of the term rhetorical responsibility as applicable to their academic research and writing. We drew on the definition of responsibility in the framework for success in post-secondary writing, which is the ability to take ownership of one's actions and understand the consequences of those actions for oneself and others. And we work to understand learning and writing as a shared process. We talked through aspects of rhetorical knowledge, which the Council of Writing Program Administrators defines as the ability to analyze contexts and audiences and then act on that analysis in comprehending and creating texts. In asking students to develop and apply working definitions of rhetorical responsibility, I hoped for two pedagogical outcomes: supporting their work applying rhetorical decision-making to, I think I have this on here, yes. Supporting their work in applying rhetorical decision-making to their writing and presentation projects in the class, and supporting students developing awareness of the value of applying rhetorical knowledge to interpersonal relationships across contexts. The initial work that I present today demonstrates progress toward that first goal, and then I'm hopeful that future analysis can help me look and see to what degree students are thinking about the second goal. So before I describe that initial analysis of student work this past semester, I just want to describe the course so that you have a picture of the projects and tasks that students are working through. So in addition to the reading, mini lessons, drafting, feedback, process reflection, conferencing, all the kinds of instructional practices that are common across all sections of the course that I developed and studied relies on peer review letters, informal presentations, and what I called listening responses, as well as on the integration of reflective writing within the rhetorical analysis project. And the study that I'm doing is I'm conducting it across 2 semesters. So I did one classroom study in the fall. I'm redoing that again this semester. The class that I studied in the fall was an online section of English 1020, and this semester I am teaching a face-to-face class. So in terms of drafting or in terms of peer review for each traditionally composed project in the class, students read and respond to each other's drafts. That's pretty typical. But their responses take the form of peer review letters that are designed specifically to help students encourage and provide constructive criticism for their peers, making sure that they identify and acknowledge the writer's rhetorical intentions. So I want them to write back to the person who they're reading from what they see that they were trying to do. Trying to integrate a space for the kinds of rhetorical listening that scholars support in our writing classes. And in terms of informal multimodal presentations and listening reflections for 2 of the projects, students select key themes from their research and analysis and writing, and they give multimodal presentations on those. They're not formal presentations in the sense of it being like a product that they've researched and produced. They're talking with their classmates, like I'm doing today, about what their research experiences were. These presentations both focus attention on developing rhetorically centered relationships between peers in the classroom. So students can begin to practice talking about their topics with each other, think about how they're conveying their research and their experiences to each other, but also they give peers an opportunity to practice listening in the class. As a form of peer review, students write listening reflections to each other trying to write down and say back to, or write back to the student who's giving the presentation what they're intending to do. That can also be a generative moment for students to continue to help each other come up with ideas for their projects. And then there's in-process and post-project reflection, and I won't necessarily talk about all the kinds of reflection that we're doing, but I'll talk about some specific prompts in a moment. The course readings are an important part of what I'm going to talk about today, because you'll hear a couple of them cited. As part of a program initiative to move toward open access text for students in our gen ed courses, my course uses primarily these open access texts in place of purchased textbooks. We use custom content written by other instructors in the composition program. And then really important at the beginning of the class are the use of popular online texts that present issues of rhetoric and responsibility in light of current events. So then the writers of those texts, who are academics and professional writers for online magazines, in those texts they're demonstrating their reflections on responsibility or on rhetoric or on rhetorical decision making. And so we use those as starting points for a conversation about what rhetorical responsibility might be. So here, these are some of the prompts of the peer review letter assignment and how I have that set up. We can look at that later too. This is a slide from one of the students' multimodal presentations where she's explaining how she formatted her essay, and an example of one of the texts that we use in the class. So the projects in the class don't veer dramatically from those in the common syllabus, but I do have a couple of additions and then some revisions to what's happening in those projects. So attention to classroom relationships is especially present in Project 2B and Project 4B, where students are giving their informal presentations to each other. And then explicit learning on rhetorical responsibility is integrated in the first and fourth projects. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those for a moment. The first project of the class, a rhetorical analysis, is a pretty traditional kind of writing assignment for a first-year writing class. But the project that I present to students includes a reflective component that focuses students specifically on developing a definition of rhetorical responsibility through their reading and analysis. And I think, no, I don't have that on there. I thought I have it. I think it's probably coming a little later. In the project, students select from a set of popular articles. They work through directed steps for reading, analysis, and drafting paragraphs, and then they compose a reflective section of the paper where they describe how the text that they're analyzing contributes to their developing understanding of rhetorical responsibility, and then how they think they're going to use that working definition to drive their research and writing work in the rest of the class. In the second project of the class, the iSearch, I'm particularly interested in asking students to engage with a variety of perspectives. So the way that the assignment is commonly taught is that students just simply practice researching and finding sources that will help them answer their research question. I ask students specifically to find resources that present different perspectives in that project. And then they build from there into writing a research argument essay on the same topic. In that third project, students are producing a portfolio of work that includes notes, outlines, synthesis maps, annotated bibliographies, their drafts, their peer and instructor feedback, and then a visual artifact that represents their argument as well. And then because of my class's participation in the composition learning community, which Walter mentioned in his introduction, they also present their research in progress to the university community at our student writing showcase at the end of the semester. So really students are getting multiple opportunities to practice talking about research and thinking about how they're presenting their ideas to multiple audiences. Finally, in that multimodal presentation they give at the end of the class, students are able to highlight to peers a key concept or a key part of their learning, what they thought was important. So there's some choice in terms of what they might choose to present in that final project. So that's the class, whether I'm studying it or not, whether I'm doing a research study. And this is a curriculum that I've been building over the last 3 or 4 years. So these projects were not new to my classroom this semester, with the exception of doing the rhetorical analysis a little bit differently. Okay. So to study this classroom, I began a teacher research study this past fall in my online section of English 1020. And I see this as a nice contribution to the work of my colleagues who have also done teacher research projects that help us think about curriculum and the way that we're teaching our classes, concepts that are important in basic writing and first year writing. And so I think that it, hopefully this project joins those conversations. But teacher research has been shown to be, while it's maybe not generalizable, a reliable research method that can respond and contribute to scholarly conversation. So a little bit later I want to think about how maybe this study can be a small piece of something bigger. As a pilot study, one initial goal of the teacher research project was to set the groundwork for a larger mixed method study across sections of first year writing at Wayne State. That was what we set out to do. Ellen and I spent time trying to figure out what it might look like if it was bigger. I think that it's not going, as I did it last semester, it's not going to be bigger. I'm not going to try to scale it that way, but I think that there are some other ways that I can implement findings from my study that'll be really interesting. So my research questions for the fall semester, admittedly large, but I wanted to kind of see what happened and what I could learn from the class. How does instructional attention to rhetorical knowledge and responsibility manifest in a first year writing pedagogy focused on these learning outcomes and habits? And I think some of that is just, I already described some of at least how it happens on my end, and the work I have from students will help me show what happens on the other end. What terms and phrases do students use to describe their rhetorical knowledge or responsibility in their written reflections? That's the one I'm really focusing on today, the responsibility part of it. What I found analyzing or even just reading students' reflective texts as a teacher last semester was that because rhetorical knowledge is really a part of all of our learning outcomes in the course, that was a little harder for me to parse out, so I'm really focusing on the responsibility piece. And then I haven't considered the third question yet, but it's an important part of the definition of responsibility that students understand learning as a shared process, so I'm interested in knowing how they attribute their learning. So these are some of the prompts that I used to study that. And to look at the ways that, or to get students talking about that. I'm skipping a couple things that I can come back and talk to you about later. In the fall 2019 semester, this is an important piece for me to present to you today. So I did consent for this project through an online Qualtrics survey. A recruiter, one of my colleagues in the department, contacted students in my class and invited them to read the information sheet and to consent to participate. And then they typed and signed their names into the instrument. Only 3 of the 23 students in my online class consented to participate in the study, which is pretty low and is actually like way lower than I expected. And I think that's probably because there's no mechanism in place to make sure that they actually read the information sheet. So I'm hopeful that the recruiter came to my class this semester. I'm hopeful that I'll have higher participation. But I can say that from just reading through some of the initial work that I have from this semester, there's something useful emerging from it. So it's not like, oh, there's only 3. Yes, there are only 3. Yes, there are a lot of cool things that I was tuning into as a teacher that I was like, oh, I really hope the students in this study, and then they weren't, so I can't present on any of it today. But some interesting patterns are coming out. So because of the nature of classroom research, I did not know which students in the class were in the study until after I turned in grades, and that same thing will be the case this semester. For this presentation, I'm going to focus just on beginning analysis of students' definition of responsibility across 3 assignments. the rhetorical analysis project, the iSearch, and the final reflective essay. Each of these projects asks students either to explicitly address responsibility, the first project and the third project, or to make a claim about their learning about writing or research. It's important for me to note that students are explicitly prompted to write these reflective passages. They're prompted to write the reflective passages in each of these projects. But I don't begin the course by stating a distinct definition of what rhetorical responsibility is. I really want them to develop that through their reading. And the second and third projects leave wide room for whether and how students will address that concept at all. So I also want to see if it becomes important to them as they're writing about it. Last semester, in the video that I made for students to watch to prepare to write their reflection passage in Project 1, I pointed them to the prompts in the assignment description, so these explain bullet points. I noted that the assignment description suggests that we can use rhetorical decision making to support our relationships with our audience. I reviewed the definition of responsibility in the syllabus, the one I showed you earlier. And I suggested moments in the assigned readings that might be helpful for us to think about, but I didn't state a definition of it for them. There may be other interesting moments in students' projects, but I'm primarily focusing today on the prescribed reflective passages. So it's like 1 or 2 paragraphs in each essay is what I looked at to do this. And by tracing the 3 students who participated, by tracing their definitions across assignments, I hope to begin to understand how students phrase their definitions of rhetorical responsibility, whether those change over time or persist across the course, how specific they are, what kinds of concepts they include in them. And I also hope to begin to understand how this attention to the rhetorical aspects of responsibility, or whether it has any impact on their writing or their development of writing knowledge in the course. The names that I'm going to use today are pseudonyms provided by my children, because that's the best way to get names. Okay, so this is just the prompt in the final reflective essay. Okay, so here we go. I have these quotes or longer versions of what I have up here are on your handouts. So Kelly selected Njama Kamara's 2019 Teen Vogue piece called Names That Are Unfamiliar to You Aren't Hard, They're Unpracticed, which is a popular article among students in my class even this semester. She selected that for her rhetorical analysis. In her introduction of her rhetorical analysis, I meant to cut that out. Sorry. So she says in the introduction of her rhetorical analysis that she's going to talk about a definition of rhetorical responsibility. She kind of maps the whole essay. And then in the second to last paragraph of the essay, she states, responsible rhetoric typically measures the degree of the validity of a statement and the sources of how that validity is measured. She then references several assigned course texts as contributing to that definition, but describes those texts in terms of how they helped her learn how to read rhetorically. So she doesn't make a clear connection, and I don't know if I put those on there. She doesn't make a clear connection between reading rhetorically and her stated definition of responsible rhetoric, except in that to a degree that both things discuss source analysis or reading texts. That's the one common piece between them. In the next paragraph, Kelly writes, after learning more about responsible rhetoric, it was interesting to use someone else's article to use my new knowledge on such an interesting topic. Being able to choose my own article makes this project easier to complete. Doing something that captivates your interest makes the task at hand a lot more interesting to do. And when you're interested in it, it is, after all, easier to learn or get to know concepts as well. And in looking at my margin comment to Kelly and Canvas, I said that if she chose to revise the paper further, which she didn't choose to do, she should be clearer about how Kamara's article helped her think about responsibility and rhetoric. So I'll connect some of those dots in my analysis myself. And to do that, I think I have to go back to that description of responsibility in the syllabus The framework for success in post-secondary writing states in part that part of how instructors can help students operationalize responsibility is to help them, quote, engage and incorporate the ideas of others, giving credit to those ideas by using appropriate attribution. And so I feel like in that final paragraph, in the quote there, that's what Kelly is mentioning, that engagement, saying that she used someone else's ideas to use her new knowledge. And that maybe she's developing that idea from looking at the definition in the syllabus. Kelly's iSearch paper on the question, what factors cause human trafficking, was like her first paper, not revised again for reevaluation, but really contained the seeds of good work to carry on into the research argument essay. At the end, in her conclusion of her iSearch, she writes, after finishing this project, I believe that not only am I more knowledgeable on the topic of human trafficking, but I can choose a side in the debate of what causes it. While that passage isn't explicitly about rhetorical responsibility or the definition that Kelly provided in the first project, it suggests to me that reading or gathering knowledge on a topic is part of what's important to her and what she's holding on to. And in that sentence, Kelly suggests that she has to gain knowledge on a topic before she can choose a side. Interestingly, at least to me, while there's an undercurrent of attention to reading or knowledge gathering in both of those first reflective passages, in the responsibility section of her final reflective essay for the semester, and I'll just go back to this prompt where this is what she's prompted to do: make a claim about what you learned with respect to responsibility, incorporate evidence, and then explain how your evidence demonstrates that. Kelly tunes into the broadest definition of the term in the syllabus. The responsibility learning outcome states that I will have the ability to take ownership of one's actions and understand the consequences of those actions for oneself and others. I think I proved that I've successfully experienced and learned more about this outcome through the numerous peer reviews I've completed and received. So peer reviews were the class activity that I most explicitly designed to help students practice responsibility, so it makes sense to me that she's using that as evidence here. And then in the final sentence of her reflective essay, she includes what I see as the closest tie to her initial discussion of rhetorical responsibility as being something about the validity of a statement, when she writes that as a writer, I think I've grown a lot in terms of being able to include my own opinion and secondary sources into my writing, and thinking about like making sure that I'm including the right opinions or the right sources or the most useful, but I'm putting some of that in there. So there's a little bit of what I saw in Kelly's 3 pieces. I can do this. There we go. Riley was a student athlete who regularly emailed me questions, whose attention to project details improved after midterms, but in the first project she didn't do the reflective section of the project. So I can't draw on an initial working definition of rhetorical responsibility, but at the end of the iSearch, Riley writes, I have also learned that research is not easy and great content comes with time, which seems like a pretty good outcome for an iSearch project. And maybe she's also connecting to that broadest definition of responsibility, understanding the consequences of one's actions for your own learning and for others. But she has 2 meaningful passages at the end in her final reflective essay that can help me think about at least how she was learning about rhetorical responsibility. In the responsibility section of her essay, Riley starts with a statement on the ethical aspects of the responsibility of appropriate citation, and then ends, she kind of starts like with a big picture viewpoint of why citation is important, and then ends with a really narrow look at why citation is important. So, and I've got the 2 big passages on there. In this case, responsibility means being honest about what part of the writing is truly written by the student and what evidence is supporting the statement. This means when you go to the library and look for evidence to back up a claim, you must report where you got the information. Then she goes and gives an example. If I were to take this and write it as my own work, I would then become irresponsible And then finally, I learned that citing correctly is very important. If you don't, your grade will suffer tremendously. So, so we move from talking about something related to honesty and credibility down to grade. So it's kind of a limited view of the purposes of citation. She describes the need to give credit, but doesn't explain how citation works to show how aspects of a larger conversation of a topic are coming together, or how the writer's choosing to position themselves within an argument. So it's maybe like a baseline definition of how responsibility might work in first-year writing, but it doesn't encompass the fullest look at what the framework defines as responsibility, and it doesn't really get us to too many of the rhetorical aspects of it. But in her section on rhetorical knowledge, she gets at a key insight about rhetorical responsibility. She doesn't name it that, but I think this is really interesting. So she writes, rhetoric looks for people's emotions or that oh my gosh reaction, such as a quote like this one in one of my earlier works, and then she integrates this quote that has some eye-opening statistics. I wrote about how not getting enough sleep impacts us greatly and can lead to an unfortunate series of events. What I learned from this is how I literally control everything about what I'm arguing. The tone, the structure, seriousness of the matter, it's all in my control, and it's a very powerful tool. I was excited when I saw this last week, because I was like, oh right, like this is important. The beginning of that quote, there's a limited view on what rhetoric does or how it's enacted. Like rhetoric is used to make people like feel something, wow. And then I read the end and I was like, wow, like yes, you get it there. You have so much control in what you're choosing to present in your writing. So that awareness of the power of rhetorical decision making seems to be one payoff of kind of just continually prompting this reflection on rhetoric and responsibility. The last student that I want to talk about is Margaret. Margaret and I had a couple of in-person conferences and a phone call during the semester. She persistently asked questions. She revised her projects after receiving feedback from me. But in her revised version of Project 1, she was really working to improve the clarity of other aspects of her rhetorical analysis, but she struggled to state a concise definition of rhetorical responsibility at the end of the paper. And Margaret's challenge in that like 5th or 6th week of the class seemed to be just getting a handle on all the terms that we were talking about. So we can see this in her first quote. From the analysis of Camara's article, Responsible Rhetoric was shown, the way things were written or placed by the author to present a point is what responsible rhetoric is. And I think as I look at the entire passage that I pulled that out of, she seems to be conflating responsible rhetoric and rhetorical strategies, because everything she gives an example of after that in the paragraph, which I don't think that I gave you the whole paragraph, but is an example of a rhetorical strategy that she had already written about in the paper. So I asked her when we had a conference kind of after the fact of the paper, and she was working on revision, she still struggled with that, to just sit in front of me and say out loud what she thought the definition was. And I don't have a record of what she said, and that's driving me crazy right now. But she writes about it in her reflective essay. She said a thing, and I said, that's it. That works. You know, that could go in your paper. It was that easy. So I thought that was really interesting. Her work on the reflective, well, that's what I just talked about. So here's where she mentions that conversation in the end of the semester. Sorry for touching the thing. Responsibility plays a role for both the author and the reader. From Project 1, I learned and discussed in person with Dr. Jenkins about the rhetorical responsibility the author holds. This is because the learning outcome for the project was to understand the responsibility of the author. Their credentials and ethos can define whether their writings can be trusted by the audience members. The responsibility also lies in the hands of the readers, because it's up to them to analyze and trust what was written. I took upon my responsibility as a reader when I was researching and found articles written by trustworthy sources. And then she goes into an example of that. So in that passage, Margaret notes that a writer's background influences how their text will be taken up by readers. Readers must carefully attend to writer's ethos when deciding whether to trust a source and whether to include that source in their own writing. And her example shows that she sees a kind of cycle between a writer, a reader, and then that reader or the student's own work in progress. The writers of the journal articles have the credentials to write about the topic. She, Margaret, reads the article because it's related to her topic and identifies their credentials or experiences as relevant. And then she can then use those trustworthy sources in her own paper, showing her own kind of academic credibility. Her point that the responsibility in engaging with a written text lies in both the writer and a reader brings together what I think all three women are starting to write about the topic. That, as Riley said, the tone, the structure, the seriousness of the matter come from the writer. And that, as Kelly seems to suggest, that choosing valid sources is important when reading for research writing. So here's what I'm working with right now, and apologies for my hand-drawn diagram. But looking at how Kelly, Riley, and Margaret write about responsibility helps me begin to see how students are understanding and applying that concept in their research writing, in first-year writing. So I'm trying to think of a visual representation of how that can work and how they might be thinking about enacting responsible rhetorical practices in research writing specifically, so not in all aspects of academic writing or outside of the classroom. So I have the dotted line is kind of like the text, like what previous authors might have considered as they were crafting their texts. The middle part kind of think of like a chambered nautilus, like start inside and go out. You can tell me later if that works or not. So the student selects a text and then analyzes it and then integrates it in their own writing. And then in the future, someone else might pick up that text and think about it, think about how it was put together, what that author carries and holds with them. It might be useful to help students attend more to their own responsible rhetoric in producing the texts that are going to at least be taken up by their classmates, certainly by me or their instructor. But even it's not uncommon for our students to be asked to post their papers online, and then if you've ever done a Google search for something and student papers come up as possible answers, those things are then taken up sometimes as sources in the future, or at least as it's like a new wave Wikipedia kind of thing. Like somebody else wrote about this topic. Who did they cite? What was important to them? How did they use a definition? So we might get them to think about that because sometimes that can be problematically taken up. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I think that's I think that's kind of an interesting cycle that I see at least Margaret paying attention to, but all three of them starting to be able to state. So some future analysis as I get into this next semester, and in May when I can see what data I've collected from the second term. I'm curious how these same concepts emerge in the reflections of students in my class this semester. Do they talk about these concepts in the same way? Do they use similar terms? Do they think about other things related to rhetorical responsibility? Like I mentioned earlier, there were certainly like things in students' homework assignments that I was really excited, like, ooh, I hope the student consented to participate in the study because this would be interesting to write about, and then they didn't. So, like as a teacher, I know the stuff, but I can't express it in my research the same way. How do students describe their work enacting responsibility in presentations? My next step is to look at these three students' presentations and think about the ways that they are doing that work. And then do students put these kinds of things that they're talking about, put these working definitions into practice when they're actually doing peer review letters? Like, are they exercising it in their interactions with classmates? So I'll be able to look at those too. Let me just say a couple things, and then I want to hear what you're thinking about in terms of classroom studies. So I noted in my abstract that I would discuss the scalability of this study because when I wrote the abstract in December, I was like, that was really pressing to me, thinking about, well, like, could it be bigger? Does it have to be bigger than just my class? And I knew that if I wanted to integrate this curriculum in other sections of English 1020, that I could do that I could make a suggestion that, we teach the rhetorical analysis this particular way, we do particular reflective assignments, do these presentations. But what I can't scale is the ways that I might respond to students, the ways that I might encourage them to take up a particular definition and keep working on it. You can't scale any one instructor's performance of a pedagogy, right? So that was really troubling to me. How am I going to get other teachers to think about this concept and carry it across the semester in the same way that I'm doing? And that frustrated me, and our conversations were difficult about that. But so to that end, I wanted to focus my energy just on what I could learn from students' work in my own classroom, and then think maybe how could parts of this curriculum be integrated meaningfully across sections. I think there's a payoff to explicitly integrating practice with and attention to responsibility in a class like our English 1020, which is focused on rhetoric and research. And thinking about how we learn from other people and how what we write contributes to their own learning seems like it fits nicely within that class. Should our program feel a concept like that merits more attention across sections, maybe there's another way to design a study to look at that. Maybe if we're interested in learning more about what rhetorical analysis does for students, or the ways that they value different kinds of rhetorical analysis, maybe a kind of multi-author mixed methods study, kind of like a really neat study that came out of U of M this year on students' writing development, has a team of people looking at writing development in a lot of different ways. And so I could see the study that I've been doing contributing to like a piece of a kind of mosaic of looking at students' attention to responsibility or rhetorical analysis. We can certainly, I can come up with ways to shape instructional practices for the first 3 projects of 1020. Attending to responsibility in the rhetorical analysis, and thinking about ways that that diagram that I'm kind of working with now might help serve as a conversation piece and an instructional piece for students thinking about how they're integrating others' work into their writing. But I do think the results of classroom studies need to be shared widely, both to demonstrate intentional research into one's own teaching and to show, even with very contextual evidence, how intentional inquiry can impact student learning. Wide sharing in the local context can lead to an informed teaching cohort. I think too many times our classroom studies just stay like in our dissertations on ProQuest, or and there's a lot of really good stuff that should be shared, even just widely within the local context. Wider sharing in the field can lead to cross-institutional research collaborations or to the development of larger mixed methods projects, and I think to more field consensus about what concepts we really value teaching in first-year writing. So not just what concepts we need to be teaching in a general education course, but what concepts we really value teaching. And I hope that my attention to responsibility as it develops through these 2 semesters successfully joins the work of the authors that I mentioned earlier, and other teachers, scholars who work to establish why attending to certain concepts is valuable, and then thinks about how we can research those more widely. So I think that's a good stopping point. What questions do you have? Amy.
I'm going to try to narrow it down, because I have like so many things. Early on in the talk, you mentioned that you did not define rhetorical responsibility for the students.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand, and then as you continued describing the classroom and what they were writing, I understood why. But then when we were looking at the student samples, I noticed that there was a definition of responsibility that the students were using that they had gotten from you. Is that correct?
Yes, so in the syllabus, underneath the reading, writing, research, and reflection learning outcomes, I integrated rhetorical knowledge and responsibility, and I quoted from the Framework for Success in Post-Secondary Writing and the WPA outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a definition of responsibility in learning, and then what I wanted them to think about and develop was how those concepts might influence the ways that they enact responsibility rhetorically. So how it comes out in their conversation. So they did have something to start from.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was part of what I was, so I see how methodologically when you're reading their responses or their reflections, you're looking for, you know, a relationship or a picking up. And granted, you had these conversations with them. It's probably going to play out differently in person than it did online.
I think so.
Right. Yeah. We can all assume that. But my question was, and is to your later points about scaling and other teachers using it with little variation. That's a really terrible way to put it. What if the learning objectives, right, are revised to explicitly include, assuming all parties were down,
Yeah.
you know, right, to include language, right, that got us to thinking about reading particularly as responsible. I haven't taught 1020 in a while, so I can't recall whether that language is in the learning objectives currently in the common syllabus.
Yeah,
But I don't think it is.
No, it's not. I used to want to memorize these, and I wish I had them memorized. It's mostly about analyzing text.
Right, and
Yeah.
so I'm thinking in terms of, I guess the question is, would you think that that would be a way in to scaling to some degree?
I think, yeah, I haven't thought about how, like I mentioned that rhetorical knowledge is already across all 4 learning outcomes. Responsibility is defined as a habit of mind. I'm gonna work my way to an answer.
Sure.
Too. And a habit of mind can't be an outcome. It can just be something that maybe is practiced, right? But if we put some of that practice, maybe not into outcomes, but maybe into the objectives, we build it into lessons, that might be something that could be done a little bit more effectively. So I think that if, I could potentially design like reading and rhetorical analysis activities that have those objectives built in, and that would be a way to scale it. I could play around with the language certainly and see, could we be more specific in how we phrase what we mean by analysis, or when we're talking about research, what we mean by integrating research. But that might be a starting point. Now, it would look different though in how every class and how every teacher does it. And I'm not so convinced that we would see results of it in like the reflective essays. So I'd have to think about how to look at it then.
Yeah, I think that goes back to a project you and I are both familiar with when it comes to how you get students to talk about something in reflection, right? Whether it's collaboration or responsibility.
Yeah.
Right? But I wrote down that you said a habit of mind can't be an outcome, and I think that is an entire section of addressing the difference between what responsibility looks like and is, and what analysis as a reading skill is.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that regardless, that is I think a really important part of this project.
Cool. Thank you.
Adrian, I have a question about an alarming sentence in Riley's paragraph.
Yes.
There. So, around the middle, okay, she first, goes through the importance of citation.
Mm-hmm.
And then she says, let's look at one of my, so she's moved into her example. And then in the next sentence, she says, I wanted to input some science into my argument because it is hard to make it up.
Mm-hmm.
How do you interpret that in terms of the journey between,
Yeah.
the first, across the,
Yeah.
you
So
know,
much.
'cause she came up with the most relevant, I think, definition.
Yes.
But
she surprised me looking through her pieces and going, oh shoot, there's nothing in project 1, there's really nothing in project 2, and then all of a sudden we get to this last one and go, oh wow, there's something meaty here. My pet answer is, I don't think she spent a lot of time on revising the reflective essay. But I wanted to put some science in my argument. I mean, she's saying it's hard to make science up. That's good.
Right.
But
that doesn't seem quite in the spirit of rhetorical responsibility.
No, it doesn't.
She's defined it.
Right,
In terms
right.
of
And maybe
integrity.
and I didn't really tune into that sentence, so I'm glad you're asking me about it. I think maybe she's thinking readers will think, because I'm presenting something that is scientific, it will be, and is cited, then they're more likely to believe what I'm saying about why sleep is important. But I don't think she's phrasing it very well.
I think it's an interesting, it's like a commonplace. It's hard to make up, but she doesn't seem to put that sentence within the concept.
She doesn't connect it to like a impact on readers or why. She doesn't elaborate on it very much, so that might be helpful. It's kind of like what she's talking about later in the rhetorical knowledge paragraph instead, but she's not connecting between those. Yes?
I have a question. This is a research class you're teaching, right?
It's our first year writing class, so they practice reading, they practice using the library to conduct secondary research, and then they practice building arguments based on research.
So they're reflecting on the research that they're doing, so that they're able to then think about how to be more effective in what they're researching. Is that?
And in what they're researching and how they're presenting that in writing.
When I thought of reflective writing, I thought, my mind went to because you didn't give the definition.
I didn't spend a lot of time on it today, no.
Well, reflective rhetoric is something, it's a new concept for me. So I'm thinking of reflective writing in that sense. So I'm going reflective responsibility, as you put it. So I'm thinking, so one is reflecting about what they're writing during research, so they're able to get a better handle on not only what they're writing, but also what they're reading. Is that what?
I think what emerged to me, my intention was that students would think more about how they are presenting their research to their classmates specifically, so that so that they were doing that in particularly thoughtful ways. What I'm seeing these students paying attention to, or at least maybe Kelly and maybe Margaret, is that a lot of that thinking happens when you're reading your sources, and like there's a lot more in that initial part, and to your point that maybe that's where some of the fruitfulness is in thinking about how to scale it, and I was thinking more in the output, but to them it seems like being a responsible researcher is in first year writing is happening from the moment you decide what you're going to read too, so that seems important, which is cool. Nicole?
I just wanted to ask a quick question in terms of future research, and as you start thinking about that last research question, the ecological ramifications of this. So as you're dreaming towards the future, and as you're thinking about this semester's study, what are some of the things you are curious about in terms of how they are taking this concept of responsibility and applying it to these sort of ecological connections?
Yeah, like how is it happening in peer review? How is it happening in their presentations? Well, actually have to kind of go back in time to think, what did I hope would happen last semester? And I was hit by a lot of difficulties with getting students to access each other's letters in Canvas, doing peer review, that kind of thing. So what I'm really excited about this semester is that logistically, their communication with each other will be much more, well, it'll be feasible because the student will be able to read a paper, write their letter, give it to their classmate can read it, they can have a conversation, I'll be able to see these things happening. Whereas the environment that I was studying was limiting that. So I'm really excited to see if those have a kind of like, if there's a kind of turnaround. I'm not talking about it really well right now, but I kind of lost hope that I would learn anything from these peer review letter assignments that I had designed thoughtfully. And I think that that there may be more conversation about it happening. And I say that because I know in previous classes, face-to-face classes, I've heard that happening. So I'm interested in seeing what I can learn from those. A challenge of only having 3 participants is that I don't think at any point do I have a letter between 2 of them. Because I don't think they're like separated in the alphabet, and so they didn't end up getting assigned to each other. And I would really love to see that. I would really love to see 2 students exchanging with each other. So we'll see if I can get that piece. And then I'm kind of I get the opportunity to talk about the presentations at C's and then the peer review letters at RSA. So I've kind of broken up the analysis across the semester. So that'll be helpful too, because I can kind of build on it. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time and being here today.